New Zealand, like many countries around the world, has a history of indigenous people being driven from their land by settlers. In New Zealand's case, it was the indigenous Māori, who had their land stolen and settled by European settlers. This has led to centuries of fighting for land and cultural rights for the Māori people. But you might have heard of the Moriori, who were the actual indigenous people of New Zealand, who were driven from their land from the Māori hundreds of years ago, enslaved and even cannibalized by them, erasing their culture and people from history.
In New Zealand, the settlers shared the land with the native people, the Maori people, a very noble warrior-like people. But the Maori weren't even the first people in New Zealand. The first people in New Zealand were the Moriori, and then the Maori came and ate them. Not even making that up. Could you imagine those initial English settlers in New Zealand? Because the British had conquered the world. They had colonies on every continent. So by the time they got to New Zealand, they're like, we've done this before, let's meet with the locals and take over. So they met with the Maori and they're like, so what happened to these Moriori people? Did you kill them? And they're like, yeah, and then we ate them. The English were like, we were thinking we could share the islands.
But the thing is, that is all bullshit.
Not even making that up.
I can smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Okay, Boomer.
We have the most enormous big gay rainbow across my electorate.
They're not going to win an election.
Let's keep moving.
The history of the Moriori is filled with misunderstanding and misinformation. The notion that the Moriori were the first peoples of New Zealand seems to be used as a smear campaign against the Māori people, and has led to the all but erasure of the Moriori culture. Many people may be skeptical hearing this, as it's such a held belief in New Zealand that it was even taught as fact in schools for decades in this country. Try searching the word Moriori on Twitter. All you'll find is anti-Māori posts as a way to dismiss indigenous grievances for Māori, as they are supposedly not the actual indigenous people of New Zealand. The best place to start to correct the record is the Moriori Claims Settlement Act of 2021.
In this bill, we set out in writing that not only was that wrong, but we put in writing the correct history of the Moriori people.
This bill was supported by every single member of parliament. Every single party voted for it. If a bill gets support from the National Party, Labour, Greens, the Māori Party and the ACT Party, it seems to be safe to assume that it's historically accurate and not some liberal whitewashing of history.
This, I think, is a nice part, if I can say that. It's a good part of the House. These bills are non-contentious. We're not bickering about them. As the House does on a number of laws, we come in agreement to settle and provide redress for past injustices.
Section 8 of this act is a good summary of the historical accounts, so let's see what actually happened. So for most of human history, no one lived in New Zealand. New Zealand was basically just a big island full of birds. It is thought that Polynesian settlers came to New Zealand around 1250, and over time settled all over the two main islands, forming unique tribes or iwi, who had their own customs, interests, and culture, pretty distinct from one another. These people are now known as the Māori, the original peoples of New Zealand, the Māori becoming culturally and linguistically distinct from other Polynesian cultures, in which they shared a common root. But wait, what about the Moriori? Well, for thousands of years, Polynesian peoples were traveling and settling around the islands in the Pacific, thought to have originated from what is now China and Taiwan. Between 1000 and 1400, Polynesians settled these islands, which is roughly 800 kilometers off the coast of mainland New Zealand. These Polynesian people lived in isolation for hundreds of years and became culturally distinct from their Polynesian roots and the Māori on the mainland of New Zealand. These people were now known as the Moriori. The Moriori are interesting as they were a pacifist people who lived by a strict code of anti-violence.
Moriori developed a unique culture on the islands where there was little differentiation of rank, and warfare and killing were outlawed.
Is a history of non-violence, Nunuku's law.
This contrasts with the Māori, who were constantly warring amongst one another, and to this day one of the most famous Māori cultural signifiers is the haka, a war dance. The Moriori were in isolation until 1791, when they came in contact with a lost English ship called the Chatham. It is said that there was an altercation on their first meeting, where a Moriori and a British sailor were both killed. After that exchange, the Moriori devised a cultural welcome and greeting for anyone who would visit the island. Now, why were there British sailors so far from home? Well, in 1642, a European traveller, Abel Tasman, came to visit, and then another James Cook in 1769, and then a boatload more people. The British settlement of New Zealand had begun. The Māori tribes practiced trade and also fought the settlers. It was far from a peaceful settlement.
We were thinking we could share the islands.
Some Europeans came to the Chatham Islands as well, mostly sealers, and they even introduced pigs for hunting on the island. In 1835, 900 Māori from two iwis, who came from modern-day Taranaki, sailed a British ship to the Chatham Islands. These men attacked and enslaved the Moriori, and due to Nanuku's law, there was no resistance from the Moriori. It is estimated that 1/6 of their population of 3,000 were killed within a year of this enslavement. The question of if the Māori cannibalized the Moriori is not provable. It is true that the Māori are known for having cannibalized people after battle, but that is not every tribe, as Māori were not a monolith, with each iwi and hapu having different customs. Cannibalism isn't mentioned once in the Moriori Settlements Act. In 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. This was a treaty between the British and the Māori. It is the founding document of New Zealand. In 1842, the Chatham Islands were annexed by the Crown, but the Crown did nothing about the enslavement of Moriori on the island. For decades, Moriori pleaded for the government to take action.
When the Crown annexed the Chatham Islands in 1842, it extended protections under the Treaty of Waitangi to Moriori. At that time, Moriori were living in a state of enslavement, with severely depleted numbers on Rekohu, as a result of settlement there by two iwi whose traditional rohe was Taranaki. The Crown was aware that Moriori had been subjugated and that many had died at the hands of their captors. Moriori Karapuna pleaded for the protection owed to them, but for many years the Crown failed to act to end Moriori subjugation.
Until finally in 1863 when a magistrate was appointed to set about improving some conditions for Moriori. Now fast forward to 1870. Europeans were trying to determine who owned what land so Western property rights could be applied to indigenous land, and so it could be properly purchased by the Crown. At this time, Māori and Moriori didn't have a custom of land ownership, more of a communal ownership by iwi and hapu. The court used a Western understanding of native customs and just took 8 days to decide that the occupying Māori iwis were actually the owners of the Chatham Islands, and gave particular weight to pre-1840 conquest. From the court's perspective, they couldn't rule over who owned the land before the Europeans were there, so they tended to use the date of the treaty as a good indicator on who owned what land.
And when we talk about the Waitangi Tribunal, Mr. Speaker, it can only go back to 1840. And so many of the hurt that Moriori, and I would say our northern tribes, which happened pre-1840, have never ever been addressed by successive governments.
Just 3% of Moriori land was proclaimed by the court as belonging to Moriori, and the crown title was awarded to individuals, not tribes as a whole, in which customary land ownership had been for hundreds of years.
Moriori's customary tenure land and the interpretation of it being held communally, whereas the Crown title individualised land titles, hence the problem that we are seeing in the passage of this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, with all treaty bills, the conflict between communally owned and guarded whenua versus individual title.
As a result of being left virtually landless, many Moriori who survived enslavement were forced to abandon the Chatham Islands. By 1901, it is believed that Moriori populations on the Chatham Islands had fallen to just 31 people, where pre-colonial New Zealand it was at around 2,000. Due to this enforced abandonment of their lands, the enslavement of their people, and the general discriminatory laws that encourage Western values and beliefs, the Moriori culture and language fell into obscurity and was close to complete destruction. Furthermore, while Māori were given the right to vote in 1867, the vote was not given to the residents of the Chatham Islands, even though they were a part of the country and paid taxes. This further disenfranchised Moriori, who had chosen to stay on their ancestral land. This was eventually ratified in 1922. 1922. In the 20th century, rumours of the Moriori were spread and even taught as fact. The 1916 to the 1946 editions of the School Journal taught generations of New Zealand school children that Moriori were an inferior race that had occupied New Zealand prior to the arrival of the Māori and had been driven out to the Chatham Islands by their later migrants. These myths caused great damage to the Moriori and were used as arguments against Māori who were having their own fight for Indigenous rights.
I am one of those that were brought up in the education system at school where I was told that Moriori no longer existed, where I was told that the effects of the people were nothing that we needed to be worried about or concerned.
I can remember growing up that the Moriori people had myths and stigma around them. And I can sort of remember, bluntly, they were the ones that had been made extinct, even though that wasn't actually the truth. And that there was a sense of, and I say this in quotes, not what I believe now, and it's certainly not what I know to be true, with the passage of this law and the historical record that is encapsulated this law, but a sense of inferiority there.
I remember myself as a school student believing that history of the Moriori people because it had been handed down from generation to generation as the true history.
The smear was repeated and published so often it became accepted as historical fact.
Due to this stigma, generations of Moriori were separated from their culture. Their language wasn't taught, their culture wasn't practiced, and their customs fell into complete obscurity.
Most of your land had been lost, the numbers of Moriori had deteriorated, and many had left the Chatham Islands. By the early 1900s, it shows that it was just an untenable place to be, and an untenable situation to be in. You were losing your historical references, you were losing the language, and you were losing your people.
Since the late 1970s, Moriori descendants have been working to rebuild their identity and culture as a distinct people with a unique heritage. What has been achieved over the last 40 years is a testament to their resilience as a people and the determination to reclaim their rightful place in the history of New Zealand. This is the history of the Moriori, the actual story. And again, all these people agreed with this history. It is not some liberal changing of history. This is what actually happened. Now, some people might hear the story and still come to the same conclusion. Oh, it's all the Māori's fault. Well, let's run through that. Yes, it's true that it was two Māori tribes that invaded the Chatham Islands and enslaved the Moriori. But remember, Māori are not a monolith. The actions of 900 Māori in 1835 cannot be held against all Māori now, can it? These were horrible actions done by these individuals to these peaceful people, but to blame all Māori for it would be crazy. And remember, Māori at the time were separated into different iwis and hapu, who all had their own customs and traditions. It would be like blaming a Frenchman for the actions of 900 Italians back in the 1800s. But if you want to point a finger at anyone, shouldn't it be at the government for not putting a stop to the decades of slavery going on in New Zealand? The Crown was very happy to make the Chatham Islands part of the country in 1842, but less happy to actually get off their ass and actually help its citizens.
And we acknowledge that those failures were both actions and inactions. Acts of omission are sometimes as powerful as acts in themselves.
This was unacceptable inaction by the governors and the Parliament of New Zealand for decades. They allowed the subjugation of their people, frankly because they weren't white, because they were from a culture and a race they deemed inferior. Then due to the complete misunderstanding of ancestral land, the Crown stole the Moriori's land with the Native Land Court. This complete misunderstanding of native land is something you see time and time again in every colonised country, with the British or other European nations just drawing a line on the map with no understanding or frankly care on how it would affect the native people. Then the spreading of false information about the Moriori for decades. For decades they taught Kiwis lies about the Moriori.
And for the Crown, it wasn't simply what was done, although there were injustices done in the Maori Land Court or the Native Land Court, I think it was at that time, but also in what was not done, what was taught and what was not taught.
The education of Indigenous customs and language is vital for future generations to understand their roots and where they came from. Pakeha know this. This is why Latin and the classics are taught in predominantly white and private schools in New Zealand. We understand that a connection to culture is enriching for future generations, but it seems that the state had different ideas of what sort of culture and customs should be taught to kids.
The Crown is profoundly sorry that it failed to uphold the partnership and provide protection. The Crown's failure to intervene to end enslavement, the Crown's failure to protect Moriori from becoming virtually landless following the 1870 Native Land Court, failure to protect te rā Moriori, te re, tāre Moriori, the Moriori language.
The 2021 Moriori Settlement Act is a great start to fixing the mistakes that were made centuries ago. The Moriori Trust has been instrumental in this revitalisation, with more and more Moriori being connected back to their ancestral roots. Kopinga Marae was opened in 2005, the only marae on the Chatham Islands. Moriori remains are being brought back to New Zealand, finally, after a lot of pressure given to foreign countries for daring to have the remains of Indigenous peoples on display like they're some sort of object to be fascinated by. And also the Moriori language is attempted to be revitalised. And maybe in the future, we can recognise it as a national language of New Zealand, as the Moriori are in fact a co-peoples of New Zealand, alongside the Māori. But the most important thing you can do is share this story. Correct people when they mention the Moriori extinction myth. Tell people about their stories, about their history. And I don't usually say this, but share this video as well. This history is too important to be kept a secret.